She was dead. That was what they had told him. That was what he had been made to believe for 3 long, merciless years. 3 years of black armbands and unopened correspondence, of portraits draped in dark velvet, of mornings where the mere act of drawing breath felt like an obscenity against her memory. 3 years of carrying a grief so immense, so consuming, that it had hollowed him out entirely, leaving behind nothing but the cold, forbidding shell that Tunn had come to know as the Duke of Ashverton. And yet, the candle in his hand flickered. It was midnight when he descended into the East Wing library, not for any particular purpose, not with any particular destination in his mind, but only because sleep had once again denied him its mercy. The library was his custom refuge in such sleepless hours. He knew its geography intimately, the scent of old leather and beeswax polish, the particular creak of the 3rd floorboard from the door, the way the shadows gathered thickly between the towering shelves like old conspirators who had long since ceased to whisper. He was not expecting on this night for those shadows to conspire against him. He had been reaching for a volume on the upper shelf, Montaigne, he thought, or perhaps Cicero, some dry and steadying text to quiet the riot of his mind, when his fingers missed the spine entirely and pressed instead against the panelled wood at the shelf's edge. There was a sound, low and deliberate, like the exhale of something long held and long suppressed. And then, with the grinding of ancient mechanism and the soft protest of hinges that had not moved in years uncounted, a section of the shelving swang inward. The Duke of Ashverton, Julian Marlowe, a man not given to outward displays of astonishment, stood perfectly still for a very long moment. Cold air breathed out of the passage beyond, not the ordinary cold of a stone manor in October, but a deeper cold, the cold of enclosed spaces, of secrets sealed tight against the warmth of the inhabited world. It touched his face like a reminder of something he could not quite name. He raised his candle. The passage was narrow but navigable, its stone walls slicked with the faint damp of years, its floor bare and dusty, save for one extraordinary detail which his light now illuminated with a cruelty that felt almost intentional. Footprints. Small, recent, the kind left by a woman's slippered foot. Julian Marlowe was not a man prone to imagination. He was, by all accounts and by his own considerable estimation, a man of reason. He had managed his vast estates with precision. He had navigated the treacherous corridors of Parliament with a cool head. He had buried his wife, or believed he had buried her, and had not wept obloquy, not once, because dukes did not weep, not in public, not where it could be observed and remarked upon and whispered about over punch bowls at Almack's. But his hand, he noticed, was trembling. He followed the footprints. The passage descended steeply for perhaps 30 yards before it curved sharply to the left and widened into what he could only describe, even to himself, even in the privacy of his own bewildered mind, as a hidden room. It was not large, perhaps the dimensions of a modest parlor. There was a cot against the far wall, neatly made, with a woolen blanket at its foot. There was a writing desk, small and plain, positioned beneath a narrow aperture in the stone that admitted, he supposed, a thread of natural light in the daytime hours. Upon the desk were papers, many papers, some stacked, some scattered, some folded as though prepared for the dispatch of a letter. There was an inkpot, recently used, a quill, a half-burned taper in its holder. And there was a woman. She stood with her back to him, pressed against the far corner, as though she might dissolve into the stone itself if she wished hard enough. Her hair was unbound, and fell in dark waves past her shoulders, tangled as though she had been sleeping, or as though she had simply ceased, in this hidden place, to care for the niceties of appearance that had once governed every moment of her visible life. She was wearing a white nightgown. She was shaking. He knew the set of those shoulders before she turned. He knew the precise way she held her head in moments of extreme agitation, that particular stiffness at the nape of the neck, that deliberate control that she had always applied to herself like a corset around some truer, wilder self that she would not permit anyone to see. His voice, when it came, was barely a sound at all. "Ilara." She turned slowly, as though the act of turning required the summoning of every reserve of courage she possessed, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in the dark of this stone room, and found now that it had arrived that no rehearsal was adequate. Her countenance was unchanged and devastatingly changed at once. The same dark eyes, wide-set and expressive, now carrying depths that had not been there before, depths that looked very much like guilt and terror and something he refused at this moment to identify as love. Her complexion was pale, nearly translucent, as though she had been existing without sunlight for longer than was wholly good for her. She was thinner, the bones of her collarbone pressed visibly against the thin fabric of her gown. She was alive. She was alive, and she was standing 7 feet from him, and she had been here in his own house, beneath his own library, and he had not known. "Ilara," her voice was a whisper, a ruin of a whisper. "I can explain." The candle flame danced between them. He was aware, distantly, of the ludicrousness of his own stillness, a duke in his dressing gown, holding a taper in a secret room, staring at his dead wife. He was aware of the cold. He was aware of the rapid percussion of his own heartbeat, which had not quickened for any reason whatsoever in 3 years, and was now conducting itself with an utter lack of decorum. Explain? The word left him flatly. He was not sure whether it was an invitation or an accusation, perhaps both. She pressed her hands together at her waist, a gesture he remembered. She had always done it when she was bracing for something difficult. The carriage accident was staged. She closed her eyes. The silence between them was extraordinary in its weight and texture. It was the silence of 3 years of mourning compressed into a single held breath. It was the silence of a marriage that had been— what had it been? He had asked himself this question many times, alone in the dark of the master bedroom, from which he had long since removed all traces of her presence, because traces of her presence were insupportable. The marriage had been arranged, correct. It had begun in the formal, courteous chill of 2 people acquainted by contract rather than by choice, correct. It then had, over the course of 2 years that he had not expected and could not account for, become something else entirely, something warm and consuming and absolutely terrifying in its tenderness, something he had not, if he was being ruthlessly honest with himself, been prepared for in the least. He was a Duke of Ashverton. He had been trained from infancy to manage property, to manage tenants, to manage political alliances. He had not been trained to manage the absolutely ungovernable sensation of being in love with his own wife. And then she died, and now she was standing in his cellar. "Tell me everything. Leave out nothing."
She told him. It took a long time. She sat on the edge of the cot, and he stood. He could not bring himself to sit, not yet, not while the room felt so unsteady beneath his feet, and she told him. Her brother, Lord Everett Cavendish, a man Julian had never particularly liked, had contracted a debt of monumental and ruinous proportion to a man whose methods of collection were not restricted by the niceties of law or conscience. The sum was beyond anything Everett could produce. He had come to Ilara, not to Julian, never to Julian, because Everett's pride was matched only by his foolishness, and he had told her that the creditor's agent intended to use her as leverage, that if Julian paid to retrieve her, it would only confirm that she was worth more leverage still, and that the demands would multiply accordingly. He said, Ilara murmured, her gaze fixed on the middle distance, that the only way to protect you, to protect Ashverton and your tenants and everything the title encompasses, was for me to disappear entirely, for there to be no leverage, no wife to threaten, no duchess, only a tragedy. Julian's jaw tightened. "I want you to hear me clearly," she said, and now she did look at him, directly, with an unflinching quality that he associated with her always, that particular form of courage that was not the absence of fear, but the decision to proceed in spite of it. I do not expect your forgiveness. I did not make this choice lightly, and I did not make it without understanding precisely what it would cost you. I knew it would cost you greatly. I knew because—" She stopped. "Because?" he prompted, very quietly. "Because I knew by then that you loved me." Her voice was steady, but only just. "Even though you had never said so. You are, Julian, positively medieval in your reluctance to say the things that matter. But I knew." He looked at her for a very long moment. "You knew," he repeated, "that I loved you, and you chose, on the basis of this knowledge, to allow me to believe you dead." "I chose on the basis of this knowledge to keep you safe." The distinction was important to her. He could see that. Her hands had tightened in her lap. "There is a difference." "There is a difference," he agreed, with a cold precision that made her flinch, "and it is a difference I intend to examine at considerable length once my present state of—" he paused, searching for a word adequate to his condition, "once my present state of absolute stupefaction has somewhat abated." She gestured then with one pale hand at the papers on the desk. "You ought to read those," she said. He crossed to the desk. He lifted the nearest paper. It was a letter, the handwriting instantly familiar, his own name at the top of the page in her careful, precise script. He lifted another, and another. There were dozens of them, scores of them, letters, all addressed to him, all dated across the span of 3 years, all, he understood in a moment of absolute wrenching comprehension, all unsent. He read the first line of the topmost letter. "My dearest Julian, it is raining again tonight, and I have been thinking of the afternoon at Whitmore Park when you laughed at something I said. You had been so determinedly unsmiling until that moment that the laugh startled us both, and I think it was precisely then that I knew I was done for entirely." His throat tightened. 3 years, he said. "I wrote to you every night." She said it simply, without excess, as though it were merely the reporting of a fact. "I could not send the letters. It was not safe, but I required the practice of speaking to you, even into the void, even knowing you would never read them." She paused. "I did not anticipate that you would find this room. I had intended to leave before the winter made the passage uninhabitable." "Leave?" He set the letters down very carefully. "And go where precisely?" "My cousin in Edinburgh has agreed to—" "No." The word fell into the room with the finality of a judge's gavel. Ilara blinked. "Julian!"
"No." He turned to face her fully. The candle was burning low between them, throwing long, unsteady shadows up the stone walls. "You will not go to Edinburgh. You will not go anywhere. The matter of your brother's creditor will be addressed, I will address it, tomorrow, through channels that are considerably more effective than staging your own death, and you will remain here." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon?" "You heard me perfectly. Julian, I am legally dead. The Ton believes me dead. The parish register. The parish register can be corrected." He took a step toward her, then another. "The Ton has survived greater scandals than the resurrection of a duchess, I assure you, and will survive this one. It will, in fact, provide them with entertainment sufficient for an entire season, which is the least they deserve for 3 years of their collective mournful condolences." Something moved behind her. Some careful, constructed wall showed its first crack. You're not furious with me?" He considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "I am," he said, "incandescently furious with you. I expect to remain so for some considerable time. I also expect to be simultaneously, and rather inconveniently—" He stopped, standing directly before her now, near enough that she had to tilt her chin upward to hold his gaze. "Overjoyed,
which is an emotion I had not expected ever to experience again, and which I find I am managing with approximately the same grace with which I managed it the first time, which is to say, very poorly indeed. Her breath caught. "Julian, I never said it." His voice dropped, stripped of its armor, raw and entirely unguarded in a way that the Duke of Ashverton was never, never unguarded. "You were correct about that. I never said it while I had the opportunity to say it, and then I believed I had forfeited the opportunity permanently, and I have spent 3 years—" The muscle in his jaw worked. "Ilara, I have spent 3 years becoming thoroughly and despicably acquainted with the particular quality of a life lived without you in it. I have no interest in continuing the acquaintance." Her crack and her composure became a fracture, became a ruin. Her face crumpled, only for a moment, only for one brief, devastating instant before she steadied herself, but her eyes were bright and her lips were pressed together in that specific way they pressed when she was working very hard not to weep. "I love you," he said plainly, the words that had taken him the entirety of 2 years of marriage and 3 years of widowhood to locate and produce. They sat between them now, strange and enormous and irreversible. "I loved you when you were alive, and I loved you when I thought you were dead," which is not a sentence I ever anticipated occasion to say, "and I will, if you remain in Edinburgh or anywhere else other than directly in my sight, love you to absolutely no practical purpose whatsoever, which seems a terrible waste for all concerned." Part 6, the resolution. She laughed. It was the most extraordinary sound he had heard in 3 years, possibly the most extraordinary sound he had ever heard, low and unguarded and helpless, and so entirely unmistakably Ilara that it was nearly too to withstand. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, her shoulders shook. "You are," she said unsteadily, "the most infuriating man in the whole of England." "Undoubtedly," he agreed. "You could not say so in 2 years of marriage. I have previously acknowledged that I am not at my best with matters of emotional—" "You are saying it now, in a cellar, at midnight, midnight, to a woman in her nightgown whom the Church of England considers deceased." He looked at her, a long, level, unguarded look that contained within it everything he had not said and everything he had written in no letters at all, having lacked even the private practice of expression she had maintained with such faithful devotion across 3 cold years. "Yes," he said. "Well," she exhaled, slowly, "I suppose that is something." He extended his hand. She looked at it, then looked at him, then placed her fingers in his. They were cold, the cold of the passage, the stone room, of all those hidden solitary nights. He folded his other hand over them. "You will come upstairs. You will be warm. Tomorrow the solicitors will begin the process of—I suspect there is a legal procedure for undoing a death certificate. If there is not, we shall invent one. My man of business will handle Everett's creditor. The matter will be resolved. And the scandal will be magnificent," he said, with a certainty that surprised even him, and brief. Scandals always are when one refuses to be scandalized by them. She studied his face. He permitted her to study it, which for Julian Marlowe was an act of considerable intimacy in itself. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I am profoundly sorry for the grief I caused you. There is no explanation for it that rises to the level of sufficient apology. I know that." "No," he agreed, "there is not." He paused. "I expect you to spend a great many years making it up to me." The brightness was back in her eyes. "Is that so?" "I am afraid I must insist upon it. I am told I am quite difficult to manage, and I will require, at a conservative estimate, the next 40 years of your sustained attention to fully repent." She laughed, a real smile, the one she had rarely produced in company, but had sometimes, in the quieter moments of their marriage, turned upon him when he had said something that caught him off guard. It was the smile he had been carrying in his chest for 3 years like a coal that had no right to remain warm. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her cold knuckles, a gesture so formal and intimate at once that she felt it rearrange something fundamental in the architecture of her chest. "Come," he said.
They walked out of the secret room together, through the narrow passage and up the steep stone incline, and back through the swinging shelf panel into the warm, candlelit library that smelled of leather and beeswax and home. The shelf swung closed behind them with a soft and definitive click. He did not release her hand. The manor was silent around them, vast and sleeping and oblivious, its many occupants safely unconscious and entirely unprepared for the morning's extraordinary development. The fire in the library grate had burned down to deep amber coals, casting a gentle warmth that the hidden room had long been without. Ilara stood for a moment in the middle of the carpet, simply breathing the warm, familiar air of a house she had never stopped thinking of as hers, even when she had believed she had forfeited her right to it. Julian crossed to the fire and added a piece of wood from the basket. The coals caught immediately, throwing new light and new warmth across the room. He straightened and turned to find her watching him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual because he had always been, without ever acknowledging it, an extraordinarily careful student of her expressions. "What are you thinking?" he asked. It was the question he had rarely posed in 2 years of marriage. He was posing it now, in the reclaimed aftermath of her resurrection, with a directness he had previously considered beneath his dignity. She considered him for a long, candid moment. "I am thinking," she said, "that I should very much like some tea." A beat of silence. Then Julian Marlowe, Duke of Ashverton, a man not given to undignified expressions of amusement, who had not laughed, not genuinely laughed, in 3 years and 3 months, laughed. It was not polished, it was not ducal. It startled them both, precisely as it had startled them both the first time, on a rainy afternoon at Whitmore Park, in another life that was suddenly, improbably, available to them again. He rang for the tea. Epilogue. The solicitors did, as it turned out, possess the relevant legal machinery for the undoing of an erroneous death certificate. It took a formidable quantity of paperwork and a small but spirited argument with the incumbent bishop of their district, but it was accomplished within a fortnight. Everett Cavendish's creditor was dealt with in a manner that the creditor found wholly unsatisfactory and the Duke of Ashverton found entirely sufficient. Everett himself was dispatched to his estate in Northumberland with a quarterly allowance and an understanding that his sister's patience, unlike his credit, was not an exhaustible resource. The Ton, as Julian had predicted, found the affair splendidly scandalous. They spoke of little else for the better part of a season. There was an entire contingent who maintained, with the cheerful tenacity of those who require a conspiracy to sustain them, that the Duchess had arranged her own death for reasons of a romantic nature, a theory which, while not precisely accurate in every particular, was at least in the correct general direction. Ilara returned the portrait to its position above the library fireplace. She had the dark velvet removed. She stood before it for a long moment on the morning of its rehinging, studying the face that the painter had rendered with greater youth and less character than she now possessed, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the odd and provisional and extraordinary sensation of being entirely home. Julian found her there. He stood beside her and regarded the portrait in silence for a moment. "You look different now," he said. "I am different now." "Better," he said, a pause, "although I should clarify that the original was also wholly adequate." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the portrait, not at her, in the way he had of delivering his most sincere statements to the middle distance, where they were somewhat less exposed to scrutiny. "Julian," she said. "You may look at me when you say things like that." A small pause. Then he turned and looked at her directly, in the unguarded way that was still new enough to feel remarkable. "Better," he said, simply, irrevocably. Outside the library windows, the October morning was cold and bright,
and Ashverton Manor rose grandly above its frost-tipped grounds, indifferent to scandal, impervious to death, carrying its secrets, even its most extraordinary ones, in the warmth of the stones that had kept faith with them across 3 very long and now mercifully concluded years. And somewhere below the east wing a narrow passage waited in the dark, its stone walls still carrying the cold of all those hidden nights, its desk still stacked with letters that need never be unsent again.